Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources and provide that strategic shortcut to being well-informed. Today, we're diving into a crisis that is really testing the fundamental bonds of the Western world. We're talking about the deepening standoff over Greenland.
It's a huge one.
A huge one. And our sources for this deep dive are very focused, very immediate. They're excerpts from internal policy discussions, reporting that was just released on January 15, 2026.
Right.
And it all centers on the geopolitical fallout after President Donald Trump revived his long-standing ambition for the U.S. to acquire Greenland.
And this came right after that U.S. military operation in Venezuela, so the idea of American territorial expansion was already, back in the global consciousness.
Exactly. So our mission today is to unpack this very specific friction. We need to go beyond that simple headline of Trump wants to buy Greenland and really get into why analysts believe this dispute poses an unprecedented, maybe even existential threat to the survival of NATO itself.
That's the critical takeaway we have to focus on. It's not just some diplomatic spat. This is a systemic risk. The sources make it absolutely clear.
Okay.
While the U.S. is pushing aggressively for ownership, the consensus in Europe is that any kind of forced acquisition, any dramatic unilateral move by the U.S. could genuinely spell the end of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Wow.
So what we're watching now is European allies in this frantic, almost desperate scramble to offer security alternatives, anything that might satisfy the U.S. without violating Danish sovereignty.
Okay, let's unpack that. I mean, we are talking about the foundation of post-World War II security. Yep. And suddenly, the source material is describing the alliance as having, what was the phrase, limited power to determine its own fate.
It's a shocking statement.
It is. This isn't a routine disagreement over defense spending, which, NATO handles all the time. What is the sheer immediate magnitude of this? Why is this specific territorial confrontation so fundamentally different?
Well, what's fascinating is that the immediate consequence of the U.S. moving toward ownership would be just unprecedented. It would be the seizure of one NATO ally's sovereign territory, Denmark's by another.
By the superpower meant to protect it.
Exactly. The nuclear-armed superpower meant to guarantee collective security. I mean, it's an act of alliance self-sabotage. The entire purpose of NATO is to deter external threats by saying an attack on one is an attack on all.
Right.
If the primary guarantor suddenly turns into the aggressor against a junior member, that entire foundational contract it dissolves instantly.
It sounds like a total betrayal of that principle. It creates a terrifying precedent for smaller nations in the alliance.
It absolutely does, and you can feel that raw fear in the sources. Sten Rinning, a professor specializing in security policy, he put it extremely bluntly.
What did you say?
He said he couldn't think of other cases where NATO has been, quote, really on the line, especially when the U.S., the indispensable anchor, is the culprit.
The culprit. Strong word.
A very strong word. The risk here isn't just about, losing control of the Arctic. The risk is the collapse of the very mechanism that guarantees European security against a hostile Russia.
And you can hear that fear just echoing. One Eastern European official described a potential takeover as earthquake situation with a risk of destroying NATO.
An earthquake. It's not hyperbole.
No. It really highlights the depth of the concern that the whole post-war order is shaking, not just over money or strategy, but over outright territorial ambition. Which brings us squarely into this core contradiction: security concerns versus territorial ambition. When the U.S. pushes this agenda so hard, what is the stated reason? What's the narrative being used?
The official public reason revolves entirely around hard security. The argument is that the U.S. needs to counter Russia and China's growing interest in the Arctic, citing the region's mineral riches, strategic sea lanes.
Okay, so a security argument.
A security argument. The specific criticism is that Greenland is currently underprotected by Denmark and therefore requires a decisive security upgrade that only full U.S. control can provide. It's all packaged as a strategic necessity.
On the surface, that sounds like realpolitik. But here's where the tension really elevates, because the reporting indicates that European officials are highly skeptical.
Very skeptical. They conclude that President Trump is motivated far more by a desire to expand U.S. territory, maybe a legacy claim, than by genuine, immediate security concerns.
And what's the evidence for that?
Well, that's the key fault line. The evidence cited is that Trump has repeatedly insisted that nothing less than ownership is acceptable.
Right.
If the motivation were purely security, you'd think a negotiated increase in U.S. military presence, or leasing more territory, or a NATO-led surveillance boost should be enough.
Logically, yes.
But by repeatedly drawing a red line at acquisition, it forces Europe to conclude the goal is expansion, not security.
And this demand, regardless of whether it even succeeds, has already caused deep, maybe permanent damage to the alliance's coherence.
Oh, for sure.
Fabrice Cauthier, who used to be NATO's director of policy planning, had a critical insight on this. He noted that while NATO can develop a serious Arctic surveillance strategy, and probably will, the alliance's credibility is already, in his words, collateral damage.
That is a crucial takeaway for our listeners, especially if you're interested in how alliances actually function. Pothier argues that Trump's unilateral claims introduce this fundamental doubt about the U.S. commitment to collective security that will be, quote, seldom forgotten.
So even if this crisis gets resolved diplomatically?
Even then, the seed of doubt is planted. It forces every smaller NATO nation to ask, if the U.S. is willing to threaten territorial integrity for Greenland, where else might it turn its focus next? The cost is long-term trust and reliability.
So how does the U.S. try to spin this politically? The sources note Trump's counterclaim that the U.S. is still absolutely committed to NATO, but the alliance would become, quote, far more formidable with Greenland in the hands of the United States.
Exactly. It's an attempt to reframe a violation of sovereignty as a necessary strategic upgrade. But politically, it's a non-starter in Europe. One side sees the U.S. seeking strategic dominance. The other sees a risk of total systemic failure that could benefit Russia immediately.
Which brings us directly to the current efforts on the ground. With the U.S. demanding ownership, what specific concrete steps are other NATO members taking right now to find an alternative?
They are desperately trying to close any perceived security gap. The strategies being discussed are logistical and technological.
Like what?
Plans for significantly more air surveillance across the Arctic, expanded maritime patrols, and a much greater integration of technology sensors, satellite links to monitor the region constantly. The goal is to prove to Washington that Greenland is not underprotected.
And they aren't just talking about it. To act quickly, we saw a really powerful, symbolic military commitment just this past Wednesday, January 14th.
Yes, that was significant.
Denmark, along with Germany, France, Sweden, and Norway, announced these small but meaningful troop deployments to Greenland for joint exercises.
And that action is highly significant. It's a collective political message. It's basically them saying, we as European allies are taking sovereign responsibility for Arctic defense together.
It's an immediate action, not just a promise.
Right. It's committing resources to show the crisis can be solved through allied cooperation, not U.S. acquisition.
But despite these quick moves, the diplomatic dead end is still apparent. We know the Danish and Greenlandic foreign ministers met with Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio in Washington, and nothing.
No resolution. The core issue of ownership versus sovereignty remains this immovable object.
And this is where the European counter-arguments about existing protections become so essential for you, the listener, to understand.
Yes. If the U.S. is claiming Greenland is undefended, the Europeans are stressing three key undeniable facts.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, and most importantly, Greenland is already covered by NATO's Article 5.
The Collective Security Pact.
The fundamental principle. An attack on one is an attack on all 32 members. So any attempt by, say, Russia to seize Greenland would already trigger a full military response from the entire alliance, including the U.S.
That immediately undercuts the idea that the island is vulnerable.
Precisely. Second, the U.S. already operates the incredibly strategic Patuxent space base in Greenland.
The old Thule Air Base.
That's the one. They have around 200 troops there, and, crucially, a 1951 agreement gives them the legal right to deploy significantly more forces immediately if they perceive a threat. The infrastructure and legal basis for a robust U.S. presence already exist.
So they don't need ownership to put troops there.
They do not. And third, Denmark itself is actively investing. They operate a specialized joint Arctic command on Greenland with about 150 personnel dedicated solely to protecting the territory.
So the Europeans are basically asking, if your concern is genuine security, we already have the treaty, the U.S. facilities, and a major Danish commitment.
Exactly. Why is destroying the alliance necessary to achieve a goal that is already achievable through cooperation?
That distinction really matters. Now let's zoom out a bit. The broader geopolitical picture. Where does this Arctic dispute fit into the priorities of other NATO members?
For many of them, it's seen as an unwelcome and dangerous distraction. Since Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the intense focus of the alliance has been on bolstering the eastern flank, Poland, Romania, the Baltics.
Right, front line with Russia.
And this fight over Greenland diverts critical military resources, diplomatic attention, and political capital away from the most immediate active conflict zones in Europe. It's a resource drain at a critical time.
And what has Russia's official perspective been on all this?
Russia is, naturally, capitalizing on the internal discord. They're claiming NATO's talk of them being a threat to Greenland is a myth designed to artificially whip up hysteria.
Of course.
They've framed the whole situation as Western escalation in the Arctic, calling it extremely dangerous, and basically suggesting that the U.S. is the true source of instability, not Moscow.
It's a convenient narrative for them when the alliance is fighting itself.
Yeah.
So on the NATO leadership side, how has Secretary General Mark Rutte been handling this? Must be a careful diplomatic line to walk.
A very careful line. His position was highly nuanced. He acknowledged that President Trump was right to highlight the need for greater Arctic security, validating the U.S. concern.
Yeah.
And then he stated that NATO is ready to put more details to the next steps as an alliance. It's a classic attempt to validate the concern while offering a consensus-based cooperative solution as the only path forward.
And that desire for a cooperative solution is backed up by Denmark's actions. The sources detail their specific investments.
They do. We're talking Boeing B-8 surveillance aircraft, long-range drones, new F-35 fighters, and air-to-air refueling capabilities specifically for the region.
These are major, expensive purchases.
Absolutely. It's Denmark saying, we are putting our money where our mouth is. We are committed to Arctic defense, which negates the need for American acquisition. It's an investment strategy designed to de-escalate this politically.
But this entire complex effort, it all hinges on one critical procedural hurdle that the source material keeps reminding us of, the consensus model.
Exactly. Because NATO operates by consensus, any major change to the alliance's Arctic security posture, the expanded surveillance, new military structures, it requires sign-off from all 32 members.
And critically, that includes the U.S.
That includes the U.S.
So even if the other 31 members come up with this perfect airtight security plan that addresses every single one of the U.S. concerns,
the U.S. can theoretically veto or delay that compromise indefinitely if they insist that ownership is the only acceptable step. That consensus model is the bedrock of the alliance. But in this specific instance, it gives the member that is simultaneously the protector and the potential aggressor an internal strategic choke point. That is what makes this moment so dangerous.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner, watching this drama unfold? As we close out this deep dive, the tension is just palpable. The alliance is caught between finding a multilateral, consensus-based solution that respects Danish sovereignty and this unilateral demand for ownership by the U.S.
And all this while Denmark and the Greenland government have consistently, loudly insisted the island is not for sale.
It's not for sale.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the ultimate challenge here isn't military capability or surveillance gaps. It's trust. The strategy of bolstering security only works if President Trump accepts it as a genuine alternative to ownership. If he doesn't, all the collective effort and resources spent by 31 allies are wasted.
So the core issue isn't what NATO can do in the Arctic from a military standpoint, or whether they can track a Russian submarine.
The core issue is whether the entire alliance can actually function when one member's territorial ambition supersedes 70 years of collective security agreements. You have to consider the radical fragility of the consensus model under this kind of internal pressure.
It's a huge strain.
If a nuclear-armed protector turns into a potential aggressor against a junior ally, the implicit assurance for every smaller NATO nation just evaporates. So the question you should be left mulling over is, does a security alliance built on trust survive when its central pillar demands a sacrifice of sovereignty from one of its own members?
A question that fundamentally challenges the purpose and future of the entire alliance. Thank you for guiding us through this unprecedented diplomatic fault line. We'll keep tracking this story and diving deep into the sources behind the headlines.